The word hit her like a branding iron pressed to bare skin. Harlot. Beatrice Tanner heard it from the back of the crowd first, hissed through someone's teeth like a curse that had been waiting all morning to find its target. Then it spread, the way fire spreads through dry summer grass, crackling from one mouth to the next until the entire main street of Caldwell, Kansas, felt like it was closing in around her. She stood in the center of it all, alone on the wooden steps of the First Methodist Church, her black mourning dress still dusty from the road she had walked to get here. Her father's coffin sat on a cart not 20 feet away, baking under the August sun of 1882. And the people of Caldwell, people she had known since childhood, people whose hands she had shaken at Sunday services, were turning on her with a hunger she had never seen before. "Her daddy's barely cold and she's already scheming to steal his land," called out Gerald Prout, the town's land assessor, a bloated man in a brown vest who had never once looked her father in the eye when he spoke to him. "That deed she's holding isn't worth the paper it's written on. Everyone knows Elias Tanner signed it over to the bank before he died." "It is worth something," Beatrice said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage, though her hands were trembling inside her gloves. "My father signed this land over to me, not the bank, to me. And I have the documentation to prove it." "You've got a forgery is what you've got," a woman called out. Beatrice recognized her, Dorothy Fenn, whose husband sat on the town council and whose smile had always been just a little too wide. "Your father was not in his right mind at the end. Everybody in Caldwell knows it. The man was sick." "He was sick," Beatrice agreed, and she felt the grief crack through her chest at the admission. "He was very sick, but he was not out of his mind. He knew exactly what he was doing. She probably poisoned him herself to get to his land faster," someone muttered from the crowd, and that was the comment that broke something open in the gathering, because after that the voices came all at once, layered on top of each other, ugly and relentless. She heard the word again. Harlot. She heard scheming woman. She heard don't let her keep 1 acre. She heard someone suggest the county judge was already in Prout's pocket and that no court would honor her claim. She stood there and took it, because she had no choice, because she had no one, because her father was on that cart and she was alone, and running would only make them believe she was guilty of everything they were accusing her of. And then the crowd shifted. It happened the way a river changes course, not all at once, but in a moment that everyone in Caldwell would talk about for the rest of their lives. The sound of boots on packed earth. Deliberate, unhurried, carrying the particular weight of a man who had never once in his life been in a hurry because he had never once needed to be. The crowd parted. Harrison Mercer walked out of that parted crowd and stepped up beside her on the church steps, and he was so tall that his shadow fell over Gerald Prout like a declaration. He turned and looked at the gathered faces of Caldwell with dark, unhurried eyes, and when he spoke, his voice carried down the street with the kind of quiet authority that made people stop talking mid-breath. "The next person who speaks against her," Harrison said, "answers to me." Nobody spoke. Gerald Prout's mouth opened and closed once, and then he seemed to think better of it. The silence stretched long and full, and in it, Beatrice Tanner felt something she had not felt since before her father got sick, since before the threats and the legal notices and the sleepless nights. She felt, for one unsteady, bewildering moment, as though she was not entirely alone. She had no idea who this man was. She had no idea why he had done what he just did. She had no idea what it was going to cost her. She would spend the next several weeks finding out all 3 answers, and none of them would be what she expected. 3 weeks earlier, Harrison Mercer had ridden into Caldwell from the north with 1,100 head of cattle and a reputation that preceded him like a storm front. He was 34 years old, which was either young or old depending on which side of the frontier you were standing on. He had built the Mercer Ranch from a single parcel of scrub land in the eastern hills of the Kansas Territory, coaxing cattle and crops out of ground that other men had dismissed as worthless, working it for 12 years, until the Mercer brand was one of the most recognized in 3 counties. He was not a man who talked much. The people who worked for him, and there were 23 of them at last count, described him with words like steady, fair, and hard. Not hard in a cruel sense. Hard in the way that good ironwork is hard. Reliable, shaped by pressure into something useful. He had come to Caldwell on business, specifically to negotiate a contract with the Kansas Pacific Railroad for the transport of his cattle east. The railroad representative, a man named Clifton Drake, had offices in the town and had been corresponding with Harrison for the better part of 6 months. The contract, if signed, would make the Mercer Ranch one of the primary beef suppliers for the eastern markets. Harrison had not come to Caldwell looking for trouble. He had certainly not come looking for a woman standing alone on church steps while a town tried to devour her. But he had pulled up his horse on the edge of the crowd, and he had listened for a full 2 minutes before he got down from the saddle. And what he heard in those 2 minutes had lit something in him that he was having a considerable amount of difficulty extinguishing. He had a dark past with injustice. Not his own, exactly, but his mother's. Margaret Mercer had been widowed when Harrison was 11 years old, and the men of the community where they lived had moved with impressive speed to strip her of everything she and his father had built together. Legal mechanisms that bent conveniently. Judges who looked the other way. A widow and her son left with nothing but each other and a westward road. His mother had rebuilt herself, piece by piece, with a stubbornness that Harrison had inherited in full, and she had raised him to know the particular sound of a crowd working up its courage to be cruel. He recognized that sound in Caldwell. He also recognized something else. The way Beatrice Tanner held herself on those church steps. Her spine was perfectly straight. Her chin was level. She was terrified. He could see it in the slight rigidity of her shoulders, the way her gloved hands gripped the paper she was holding, but she was not running. She was not crying. She was not begging. She was standing her ground against 20 people who wanted to take something from her, and she was losing, and she still was not running. He admired that more than he could reasonably explain. After the crowd dispersed, and it dispersed quickly once it became clear that Harrison Mercer was serious about his statement and was not moving from those steps, Beatrice turned to look at him. Her eyes were dark brown and extremely direct, and she looked at him the way someone looks at a piece of unexpected weather, uncertain whether to be grateful or suspicious. "I don't know you," she said. "Harrison Mercer." He removed his hat briefly. "I run cattle in the eastern hills." "I know the Mercer name," she said. "I don't know why you just did that. Because what they were doing was wrong." She studied him for a moment, and he could see her weighing the answer, turning it over, looking for the hidden motive. In his experience, most people had one. Most people did not step into someone else's fight without wanting something in return. "What do you want from me, Mr. Mercer?" she asked, which told him she had the same experience. "Nothing," he said, and he meant it, and she did not believe him, which was also something he understood. Her father's burial took place the following morning in the small cemetery behind the church. The attendance was sparse. A few of Elias Tanner's old friends, men and women who were too old or too principled to follow the crowd the day before, stood at the graveside with their hats in their hands and their faces respectful. Beatrice stood at the head of the grave in the same black dress, and Harrison Mercer stood 20 feet back near the cemetery gate, not close enough to impose, close enough to be visible. He could not have said why he stayed. He had told himself, the night before in the boarding house where he was staying, that he had done what needed doing and that the woman's situation was not his concern. He had a railroad contract to finalize. He had 1,100 cattle in a holding pasture north of town. He had a ranch that needed its owner. He came to the cemetery anyway. After the service, after the other mourners had pressed Beatrice's hands and drifted away, she walked toward the gate and stopped a few feet from him. She had been crying, recently and quietly, in the way that people cry who have been practicing restraint for a very long time and can only allow themselves a small, controlled amount of grief. "You came," she said. "I did." She looked past him, toward the street, where Caldwell was going about its Tuesday morning business as though the previous day had not happened. "They are going to try to take the ranch," she said. "Prout has been laying the groundwork for months. My father knew it. He put the deed in my name specifically to prevent it. But Prout has Judge Alderton in his pocket, and I have nobody who will testify on my behalf." "What does the deed say?" She pulled the paper from inside her coat. He had not expected her to show it to him, and the gesture surprised him. She held it out and he took it and read it carefully. It was legal and clear and bore a proper notary seal from a man named William Atchison. "Atchison still lives in Caldwell?" he asked. "He does," she said. "Then Prout cannot claim forgery without discrediting his own notary. Atchison is also the notary for half the property deeds in this county, including some of Prout's own transactions." Something shifted in her expression. "I know that," she said. "But knowing it and being able to argue it in a courtroom without a lawyer are two different things." "Do you have money to retain a lawyer?" "I have the ranch. At the moment, that is all I have." He handed the deed back to her. He looked at the street again, at the ordinary Tuesday morning business of a town that had tried to eat her alive yesterday. He thought about the railroad contract. He thought about his mother at the graves of other people's fathers, alone. "I know a lawyer in Wichita," he said. "I'll write to him today." She stared at him. "Mr. Mercer, Harrison." "Harrison." She said his name like she was testing the weight of it. "You don't owe me anything." "No," he agreed. "I don't." "Then why?" He put his hat back on and looked at her with those dark, steady eyes that his ranch hands found simultaneously reassuring and somewhat intimidating. "Because what Prout is doing is wrong," he said again, "and I have seen it before, and I have a particular dislike for watching it happen twice." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "My name is Beatrice." "I know," he said. "Half the town was shouting it yesterday," and she laughed. It was small and brief and surprised sounding, as though she had not intended it. But it happened, and in the gray light of the cemetery morning after her father's burial, it was the most unexpectedly beautiful thing Harrison Mercer had heard in a long time. He wrote the letter to his lawyer in Wichita that same afternoon. Thomas Hawley was a sharp, dry-humored man who had handled Harrison's property transactions for several years, and who had, on more than one occasion, expressed a deep personal offense at watching powerful men use the legal system as a private weapon. Harrison laid out Beatrice's situation in careful detail. The deed, the notary, Prout's influence over the judge, the timeline of the harassment that Elias Tanner had apparently documented in letters to his daughter. He sent the letter on the afternoon stage and did not mention it to Beatrice. He did, however, call on her the next day at the Tanner property, which sat 3 miles south of Caldwell along a creek that ran copper-colored in the summer heat. The house was small but well kept, with a vegetable garden that was overgrown at the moment, but showed evidence of having been carefully tended. The cattle on the property were thin, not starved, but not thriving, and Harrison spent about 5 minutes looking at them before Beatrice appeared on the porch with her sleeves rolled up and her hair escaping from its pins, in a way that suggested she had been working hard at something that required both hands. "You're looking at my cattle," she said. "I am. Do you want to tell me what you think?" He did, because she asked directly and he had never seen the point in varnishing things. "They need better water access. The creek is fine, but the approach is poor. They're walking too far and working too hard to drink, and it's showing." She came down off the porch and stood beside him, squinting at the herd. "My father managed it well enough for 20 years. Your father was here to manage it," Harrison said, not unkindly. "You've been managing him for the last 8 months. The cattle haven't been getting the same attention." She was quiet for a moment. He wondered if he had overstepped. Then she said, "What would you do differently?" he told her. He told her about redirecting the water access, about the simple construction that would be needed, about the grazing rotation that would help the grass recover. He talked for about 10 minutes, and she listened to all of it without interrupting, which he found both unusual and pleasant. "You know a great deal about other people's cattle," she said when he finished. "I know a great deal about cattle," he said, "whether they're mine or not. Would you—" She stopped, started again. "Would you be willing to help me with it, the water access specifically?" "I could pay you in." She stopped again, and he saw the particular discomfort of someone who has very little and is being asked to calculate what they can spare. "You don't need to pay me," he said. "I'm not taking charity, Mr. Mercer." "Harrison," he said it patiently, "and it isn't charity. You can return the favor when I'm in a spot someday." She looked at him with those dark eyes again, with that careful, measuring expression that he was coming to understand was simply how Beatrice Tanner looked at everything, not with suspicion exactly, but with the attention of someone who had learned the hard way that the details matter. "All right," she said. "Harrison." The days that followed had a shape to them that Harrison would not recognize as significant until later, when he was lying awake at night in his boarding house room, turning them over in his mind with the particular attention of a man who has begun to suspect he is in trouble. He came to the ranch each morning. He worked alongside her, not for her, but alongside her, which was a distinction she seemed to notice and appreciate. She was not a woman who stood aside and watched men do things. She had grown up on this land, and she knew it in the intimate, specific way that people know things they have loved since childhood. She knew which fence posts were sturdy and which were rotting. She knew the temperament of each individual animal in her small herd. She knew where the grass grew thickest and where it gave out. What she lacked was manpower, and he was available, and so they worked. He learned things about her in those mornings. She had been educated. Her father had been a reader, and the small house was full of books, and she had an acerbic, precise wit that she deployed selectively, when she felt comfortable enough, which was becoming more often. She had strong opinions about water rights, about the railroad's impact on small ranching operations, about the particular brand of hypocrisy practiced by men like Gerald Prout, who positioned themselves as pillars of community while systematically plundering it. She made coffee that was strong enough to remove paint from a barn door, and she made it every morning without apology, and Harrison drank every cup. He told her about his mother on the 4th day, which surprised him because he rarely told anyone about his mother. Not because he was ashamed of her. He was, in fact, fiercely proud of her, but because the story was also his story, and his dark past was something he kept private out of long habit. They were sitting on the porch after a full morning of fence work, and Beatrice had said something about being tired of having to justify herself to people who had already decided what she was before she opened her mouth. And Harrison had said, more quietly than he intended, "My mother had the same problem." Beatrice looked at him. She did not push. She simply waited with that quality of patient attention that he had noticed before, and he found himself telling her about his father's death, about the men who had arrived with their legal papers, about the road west, about his mother's hands, calloused and steady, rebuilding what other people had tried to take. When he finished, the silence between them was a different kind of silence than it had been before, warmer, more settled. "She sounds extraordinary," Beatrice said. She was. "She died 4 years ago," he said. "She saw the ranch before she went. She was proud of it." He paused. She was the kind of person who felt pride without letting it show too much, like it was a private thing. Beatrice was quiet for a moment. "My father was the same way," she said. "He told me once that he was proud of me, just once in all my life. But the way he said it," she stopped, swallowed. "It was enough." Harrison looked at her and felt something move in his chest that he could not comfortably name, something that lived in the same region as admiration, but was considerably warmer and more complicated. He looked away before she could see it on his face. Thomas Hawley arrived from Wichita on the following Thursday, dusty and carrying a leather satchel full of papers, and Beatrice was in the middle of mending a section of fence when he rode up the lane and introduced himself. She looked at him. She looked at the lane behind him. She looked at the Mercer ranch brand on the horse he'd borrowed for the ride. She waited until that evening, when Harrison arrived to review the fence work they had planned for the following morning, and she stopped him on the porch steps with one hand and looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between gratitude and frustration. "You sent me a lawyer," she said. "I wrote to a lawyer on your behalf," he said. "There's a difference, not a particularly significant one. Thomas is a good man. He'll read your deed and tell you exactly where you stand. No obligation, Harrison." She said his name in the particular tone of a woman who is trying to be firm and is also being undermined by her own feelings. You cannot keep doing things like this without consulting me. Would you have let me send for him if I'd asked first?" She opened her mouth, closed it. "That is not the point." "You're right," he said. "The point is that Pruitt's man has been watching the property. I saw him on the North Road yesterday. You needed a lawyer faster than you were going to get one on your own." The frustration in her expression shifted slightly. "Someone was watching the property, one of Pruitt's hired men, a fellow named Clemens. He wasn't subtle about it." She pressed her lips together. "What is Pruitt planning? I don't know yet, but I think he's waiting for you to make a mistake. A missed debt payment, a legal error, anything he can use to file a challenge to the deed. If Thomas reviews your situation now, we'll know what vulnerabilities he might try to exploit." She was quiet for a long moment, looking at him in the last light of the evening. "You have been thinking about this," she said. "I have, on my behalf." "Yes." She looked down at her hands, back up at him. "Why does this feel like something more than just doing the right thing?" He held her gaze and felt the question land in exactly the place she had probably intended it to land, which was directly in the center of the chest. He was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who spoke carelessly. "Because maybe it is," he said. She breathed in once, slowly. Her expression did something complicated and then settled into something quieter and more careful. "Thomas will stay in the spare room," she said. "There is enough food. And tomorrow I will sit with him and go through every document my father left, and I will sort this out myself with the help you have provided. That is as far as I am comfortable letting this go right now." "That's fair," Harrison said. "I am not a woman who can be swept along by someone else's decisions, even well-intentioned ones. You should know that about me. I do know that about you." "Good." She turned toward the door and then paused with her hand on the frame. "Thank you," she said without looking back, "for all of it." He stood on the porch steps long after she had gone inside. listening to the Kansas night, the crickets and the cattle and the distant sound of Caldwell settling into its evening. And he thought that he had been within arm's reach of some very beautiful things in his life and had never quite been able to take hold of them. And he was not certain whether that was going to change. Thomas Hawley proved immediately useful. He spread Beatrice's documents across her father's old dining table and spent 3 hours reading them with the focused intensity of a man who genuinely loved the law the way some people love puzzles, turning pages and making notes and asking Beatrice precise, unhurried questions. At the end of those 3 hours, he sat back in his chair and said, "The deed is absolutely sound." Beatrice exhaled. Prout cannot challenge it on the grounds of forgery without implicating himself, because Atchison notarized it, and Atchison has notarized half of Prout's own property transactions. That's leverage that cuts both ways. Thomas tapped his pen on the table. The more likely attack vector is what I'd call a manufactured debt claim. Has anyone approached you about outstanding payments your father may have owed? The bank sent a letter 3 weeks ago suggesting there was an outstanding balance on a loan my father took in 1879, Beatrice said. But when I went in to review the records, the ledger showed the loan was fully repaid in 1881. I made a note of it. Good. Do you have the bank ledger entry documented? I made a copy of the relevant page. My father's lawyer, before he retired, had always told me to make copies of everything important. Thomas looked at her with the expression of someone genuinely delighted. Miss Tanner, you are extremely well prepared for someone in your situation. My father taught me that the best way to be treated fairly is to make it impossible to be treated unfairly. Thomas wrote something down. There is one other vulnerability, he said, and it concerns me more than Prout's shenanigans. Judge Alderton is not the most honest man in Kansas, and if Prout manages to get this in front of him, we will need a counter move. Specifically, I would like to file an immediate documentation of the deed with the county seat in Wellington rather than relying on the Caldwell records, which Alderton has some authority over. Can we do that? Beatrice asked. We can. It requires a ride to Wellington, but yes. Once it's in the Wellington record, Alderton cannot touch it without state-level intervention, which Prout does not have the connections to arrange. Harrison, who had been sitting quietly at the edge of the conversation, said, I can ride to Wellington. Both Beatrice and Thomas looked at him. The railroad negotiation can wait another day, he said. I can have the filing in Wellington before the end of the week. Beatrice held his gaze for a moment with that particular expression, the measuring one, the careful one, the one that had started doing something very specific to his chest whenever she directed it at him. We will go together, she said. It should be me who files it. It should, Harrison agreed. I'll ride with you. The ride to Wellington took the better part of a day, and they left before dawn to make the round trip manageable. Harrison rode his bay stallion, Atlas, a horse of considerable size and extremely definite opinions about pace and direction that Harrison had owned for 7 years and trusted more than most people. Beatrice rode a sorrel mare named Clara that she had raised from a foal, and the two horses got along tolerably well after the initial period of mutual assessment. The road south from Caldwell cut through rolling grassland, and in the early morning light, it had a particular quality of stillness that Harrison had always found quieting. The sky went from dark blue to pale gold to a full burning summer blue, and the birds came up with it, and the grass moved in the early breeze. Beatrice was not a person who felt the need to fill silence, which he appreciated. They rode for the first hour without speaking, and it was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that two people share when they have already established a sufficient vocabulary of smaller communications. A nod, a glance, the simple awareness of another person's presence, and do not need to add words to it constantly. When they did talk, they talked about everything, about the railroad and what it was doing to small cattle operations, about the settlement patterns in Kansas and what they meant for the next generation of people trying to work the land. About books. She had read Dickens thoroughly and had specific and entertaining opinions about his characters. About the quality of the light over the grassland at this particular hour. At noon, they stopped at a creek to water the horses and eat the provisions Beatrice had packed: bread, dried beef, a small jar of preserved peaches that she produced from her saddlebag with the air of someone presenting something precious. "Preserved peaches," Harrison said. "My father's favorite. I made them last fall. I have been saving this jar." She opened it and held it out to him first. He took a peach slice and ate it. It was sweet and clean, with the particular taste of something preserved at exactly the right moment of ripeness. "That's extraordinary," he said. "I know." She ate one herself with an expression of concentrated pleasure that made him look away at the creek, where Atlas was drinking with deep, self-satisfied pulls. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Why are you still in Caldwell?" "The railroad contract. How long has that negotiation been going?" "6 months of correspondence," he said. "The actual meeting with Drake took 2 days. I should have signed and gone home by now. But you're still here." He was quiet for a moment, watching the water. "I am still here." "Is it because of me?" she asked, and her voice had a directness that he had come to expect from her, but that still sometimes caught him unprepared. He turned to look at her. She was sitting on a flat rock with her hat in her lap, and the preserved peaches between them and the creek light moving on her face. And she was looking at him with those dark eyes that asked questions they already knew the answers to and asked them anyway, because they believed in honesty. "Yes," he said. She absorbed that quietly. "I should tell you something," she said. "All right. I have spent the last 8 months watching my father die, and before that, I spent 3 years refusing 2 different proposals of marriage from men who wanted the land more than they wanted me. And before that, I spent most of my life being told that my opinions were inconvenient and my independence was inappropriate." She looked at the creek. "I am not easy to love, Harrison. I am told this fairly regularly." "By people whose opinion I'd discard," he said. She looked at him again. Something in her expression had changed, softened at the edges while the center of it remained entirely clear and direct. "I am not a project," she said. "If that is what this is, if I am something you are fixing, the way you fixed the water access for my cattle, you are not a project," he said, with a certainty that surprised him with its own force. "You are the most." He stopped. Started again, choosing words with the care he always brought to things that mattered. "You are the most genuine person I have spent time with in years. That is not something I am trying to repair. It is something I am trying to be near." She looked at him for a long time without speaking, and the creek moved and the horses drank, and a pair of meadowlarks made their sound from somewhere in the grass. "We should get to Wellington," she said finally. "Yes," he said. But neither of them moved for another full minute, and the air between them was full of something that had not been named yet, but was absolutely there, present and warm and considerably stronger than either of them had been expecting. Wellington was a larger town than Caldwell, with a proper courthouse and a county records office staffed by a meticulous man named Bernard Cole, who took Beatrice's documentation with the gravity of someone who understood exactly what it meant. He reviewed the deed and the notary seal, and made the official filing with the precision of someone who has no time for ambiguity and no interest in favors. "This is now on record in the Wellington County office," he told Beatrice, handing her the receipt. "Any challenge to this deed will need to be filed here, not in Caldwell. The Caldwell court has no jurisdiction over a Wellington filing." Beatrice took the receipt and held it for a moment, and Harrison watched something leave her face. Some weight she had been carrying so long she had probably stopped noticing it. She folded the receipt into her coat with the same care she'd shown the deed itself. "Thank you," she said to Bernard Cole. "That's what the office is for, madam," he said, and went back to his work. Outside, on the Wellington courthouse steps, in the full heat of the August afternoon, Beatrice turned to Harrison, and he could see that she was working very hard to maintain her composure, because the alternative was probably crying, and she was not a woman who cried easily in front of people. "It is done," she said. "It is done." She pressed her lips together. "My father, he fought so hard to secure this. He spent his last weeks making sure every document was in order, making sure I would have something to stand on. He could barely hold a pen at the end, and She stopped. Harrison took one step toward her, and then another, and he put his hand gently on her arm, just below the elbow, a light and careful contact, because he did not want to presume and he did not want her to feel she was being managed. He simply wanted to give her a point of steadiness to press against. She reached up and put her hand over his, just for a moment. Then she straightened, and she was Beatrice Tanner again, spine straight and chin level, except that her eyes were bright with something that she had allowed herself to feel briefly and was now putting away. "Let's start back," she said. "I want to be home before dark." The ride back had a different quality than the ride out. Something had shifted, not dramatically, not explosively, but in the quiet, consequential way that things shift when the truth has been spoken and received and not destroyed. They talked more easily. They laughed at things. Harrison told her about a disastrous cattle drive in 1878 that had involved a thunderstorm, a borrowed mule with very specific moral objections to the direction of travel, and an eventual resolution that had cost him 2 days and considerable dignity. She laughed until she had to stop her horse, and the sound of it rang across the grassland. She told him about the first time she had tried to negotiate with a cattle buyer at the age of 22. The year she had come home from the women's seminary in Lawrence, where her father had sent her. The buyer had spent the entire conversation talking to her father, who was standing 3 feet away and kept pointing back at Beatrice and saying, "She's the one you're talking to, sir." By the end of it, she had gotten a better price than her father had expected, and the buyer had left looking slightly dazed. "How old are you now?" Harrison asked. 26, she said. "You?" 34. She considered this for a moment. "My father was 35 when he married my mother," she said. "She was 29. He looked at her. She was looking at the road ahead with a very neutral expression, and he understood that she was doing with this information exactly what she did with all information, presenting it clearly and letting him decide what to do with it. He decided to do something about it. "Beatrice," he said. "Harrison, I would like to call on you properly," he said, "if you are willing." She was quiet for a moment. "You have been calling on me every morning for 2 weeks, she said. "As a neighbor," he said. "I mean differently." "I know what you mean." She looked at him now, with those eyes that were fully honest and fully present and absolutely not going to make this easier than it needed to be. "I am willing," she said, "but I need you to understand that I am not going to rearrange myself to fit what someone else thinks I should be. I did that for 22 years and then I stopped, and I am not going back." "I would not ask you to," he said. "I am not particularly interested in someone who has been rearranged." The corner of her mouth curved. Good, she said. Then yes, call on me properly. They rode into the Caldwell County Road as the sun was going down, and the sky was doing what Kansas skies do at the end of a clear summer day, going pink and orange and a deep, extraordinary purple at the far edge, and the land spread out under it wide and still. Gerald Prout received word of the Wellington filing within 2 days, and his response was to accelerate. Harrison learned about it from 2 sources simultaneously. From Thomas Hawley, who had been watching the situation carefully from his room at the boarding house, and from one of his own ranch hands, a quiet and observant young man named Pete Sims, who had been in the Caldwell saloon the previous evening and had overheard Prout talking to a man named Victor Crane. Victor Crane was not from Caldwell. He was from Dodge City, and his reputation was not good. He operated in the ambiguous territory between legal and illegal enforcement of financial arrangements, which was a polite way of saying that he pressured people into bad decisions, and occasionally did worse when pressure didn't work. Harrison told Beatrice this the following morning, and he watched her face go very still in the way it went when she was processing something alarming and deciding not to let the alarm run away with her. He hired a man from Dodge City, she said. It appears so. Because the Wellington filing blocked the legal route. Yes. So now he is going to try something else. She set down the coffee mug she had been holding. What kind of something else? I don't know yet. But I think we should assume it is not going to be pleasant, and I think you should not be out on the property alone. She looked at him. Harrison, I know what you're going to say. Then why are you saying it? Because it is true, he said, and because I need to say it, and because you can disagree with me completely and still let me worry about you. The directness of that landed on her face in a way that seemed to surprise her, and she was quiet for a moment. Fine, she said. I will take the concern under advisement, but I am not going to cower inside this house because Gerald Prout has hired a bully. Nobody is asking you to cower, he said. I am asking you to let me post one of my men on the North Road. She considered it. All right, she said. 1 man. Pete Sims, if he's willing, I've seen him around. He seems careful. He's the most careful person I employ, Harrison said. What none of them anticipated was that Victor Crane's approach would not be direct. He was too experienced for that. Instead, he went to Dorothy Fenn, and then to the town council through Dorothy Fenn's husband Archibald. And within 3 days, a council meeting had been called to discuss what they termed a matter of public interest regarding a contested property in the county. Thomas Hawley attended the meeting and reported back to Beatrice and Harrison with the expression of someone who has heard a great deal of legal creativity deployed in a short period of time. They are attempting to argue that Elias Tanner was legally incompetent when he signed the deed, he said. They found a doctor, not a local man, someone from outside, who will testify that Elias was not mentally capable in his final months. That is false, Beatrice said quietly. I know it is. The question is whether we can demonstrate it is false. Do you have anything documenting your father's mental state in his final months? Any written correspondence, any transactions he completed, any witnesses who can speak to his cognizance? Beatrice was quiet for a moment. Then she said, He wrote me a letter 3 weeks before he died. He wrote it himself in his own hand. It is very clear and very detailed and covers at least 4 different practical matters related to the ranch. It is not the letter of a man who did not know what he was doing. Thomas sat up straighter. Do you have this letter? I have it, she said. I have kept everything he ever sent me. She went to the trunk in her father's bedroom and came back with a small cedar box. She opened it and produced a folded letter, and Thomas read it with the careful attention of someone reading a legal argument, because that was precisely what it was going to become. "This is excellent," he said. "This, combined with Atchison's notary record, combined with 2 or 3 witnesses who can speak to Elias's clarity of mind, will very effectively bury the incompetence argument." "Who would testify?" Harrison asked. "I would," said a voice from the doorway. They all looked. A man was standing in the open door. Harrison had not heard him approach, which spoke to both his own distraction and to the visitor's quiet step. He was in his late 60s, with a weathered face and a minister's collar. "Reverend Graves," Beatrice said, and something warm moved through her voice. "I spoke with Elias every week for the last 6 months of his life," the Reverend said, stepping inside with his hat in his hands. "He was the sharpest man in the room until the very last week. I would be honored to say so in any court that will hear me." He looked at Beatrice with an expression of gentle, uncompromising certainty. "Your father was a good man and a clear-minded one, and I will not let them say otherwise." The council meeting reconvened a week later, and Thomas Hawley came prepared with a thoroughness that clearly unnerved the council members who had been expecting a scared young woman standing alone. Beatrice was not scared, and she was not alone. Harrison sat in the back of the council room and said nothing, because this was her fight to win and she was going to win it. And his job was simply to be present and steady and make it clear to anyone in the room who might consider interfering that interfering would not be worth their trouble. Thomas presented the Wellington filing, the letter, the bank repayment records, and the Atchison notary documentation. Reverend Graves testified with the calm, undeniable authority of a man who had been speaking truth to rooms of skeptics for 40 years. 2 of Elias's old friends corroborated. The Dr. Prout had brought in from outside, took one look at the assembled evidence, and gave testimony that was notably less emphatic than it had apparently been in private conversations. The council voted 4-2 to dismiss the incompetence claim. Prout turned red and left the room before the vote was fully recorded. Victor Crane was gone from Caldwell the following morning. Thomas shook Beatrice's hand outside the council building and then Harrison's, and said he would check in once more before heading back to Wichita. Harrison thanked him, and after Thomas left, Harrison and Beatrice stood on the boardwalk outside the council building in the full heat of the August afternoon. "It is over," Beatrice said. "The immediate threat, yes," Harrison said. "Prout will not try the same approach again. He's been embarrassed publicly, and embarrassment at least temporarily paralyzes men like him. And when his paralysis wears off, by then the Wellington filing will have been in the record long enough that it would take state-level intervention to challenge, and he does not have that kind of reach." Harrison paused. "You are safe, Beatrice." She looked at him. "We should celebrate," she said. "I have a bottle of my father's whiskey that he was saving for an occasion worth saving it for, and I cannot think of a better one." "I would like that very much," he said. That evening on her porch, with the bottle between them and the Kansas stars coming out one by one in the enormous overhead dark, they talked in a way that had no specific direction, and no agenda and no urgency, which was a new thing between them and felt like luxury. She told him about her childhood on this land, the way summers smelled, and the way winter brought a silence so complete you could hear your own heartbeat against it. He told her about the early years of building the ranch, the seasons that were bad enough to bring doubt, and the particular stubbornness that had gotten him through them. They talked about what they wanted. Not abstractly, but specifically, the practical shape of a future lived close to the land, and close to people who were worth something. At some point the conversation slowed and they were just sitting, and the night was very quiet, and she was close enough that he could have reached out and touched her hand. He did reach out, and she did not pull away. She turned her hand under his so that their fingers were properly laced, and she looked at the stars with an expression of someone who has been given something they were afraid to want and is choosing to receive it. "I was afraid of you at first," she said. "I know. You are a very certain person." "Is that frightening?" "It was," she said, "because I wasn't sure whether you were certain about good things or bad things." She paused. "I know now." "What do you know?" She looked at him. "That you are the best person I have met in a very long time," she said, "and that it terrifies me, and that I am choosing not to run from it." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips against her knuckles, briefly and with great care, the way you touch something you do not want to drop. "I am not going anywhere," he said. She looked at him for a moment and then leaned her head back against the porch post and looked at the stars again, with his hand in hers. And the Kansas night went on around them, enormous and lit, and completely indifferent to the smallness of two people sitting on a porch discovering something important. The weeks that followed were the warmest of Harrison's life. He finalized the railroad contract with Clifton Drake, who had waited with patient good humor for the conclusion of what he termed your local business, Mercer, and who was satisfied with the terms they finally agreed on. The contract secured Mercer Ranch as a primary beef supplier for the next 3 years. It was the kind of agreement his mother had always said was 1 step forward and 2 steps toward a real life. He did not immediately leave for the ranch. He made arrangements with his foreman, a capable and unflappable man named Samuel Brooks, to oversee operations for an additional month. He sent word of the railroad agreement and asked Samuel to begin preparations for the autumn drive. He spent that additional month in Caldwell. He spent it, specifically, in the particular company of Beatrice Tanner, who had begun to let herself be happy in a way that she seemed to approach as an unfamiliar skill to be practiced carefully rather than a natural state to inhabit. He found this deeply moving. He found almost everything about her deeply moving, which was not something he had experienced before and which he was finding simultaneously wonderful and somewhat difficult to manage in the context of behaving with appropriate restraint. He called on her every day. Sometimes they worked. Sometimes they rode out to the eastern hills, where he showed her the country he had come from. Sometimes they sat on her porch with books, reading in the same comfortable silence that had characterized the earliest mornings they had spent together, but which meant something different now. He told her he loved her on a September morning when the air had the first cool edge of autumn in it, and she was standing in her vegetable garden in her working clothes with mud on her hands, examining a row of beans with an expression of absorbed concentration. And something about the sight of her, ordinary and entirely herself, not performing anything for anyone, made the words simply arrive in his mouth without any particular drama. "I love you," he said. She looked up from the beans, a long, clear, honest look. "I love you too," she said. "I have for a while. I was waiting to see if you needed to say it first." "Why?" "Because sometimes people don't, and then it becomes a different kind of thing," she said. "And I did not want a different kind of thing." He stepped into the garden and took her muddy hands in his. He was not particularly concerned about the mud, and he said, "I would like to marry you if you will." She looked at him with that measuring expression. He waited. "We have known each other 2 months," she said. "I know." "My father knew my mother for 3 weeks before he asked her," she said. "She made him wait a year." "I will wait," he said. "As long as you need." She smiled, small and real and with both eyes in it. 6 months, she said. "That is what I need." 6 months, he agreed. "And I want to see the ranch," she said. "Before I decide anything about living somewhere new, I want to see the place. I will take you whenever you like." "March," she said. "In the spring, when the worst of the winter is done. I will ride out to the Mercer Ranch in March and see what you have built." "I will be there waiting," he said. He did not actually leave for the ranch until November, and leaving was considerably harder than he had anticipated. He stood at the edge of the Tanner property in the early November morning with Atlas saddled and his pack horse loaded, and Beatrice stood on the porch steps in her coat against the chill, and they looked at each other across the distance he was about to put between them. "Write to me," she said. "Every week," he said. "More than once a week," she said, which meant she was also finding the distance difficult, which she would not say directly but which she had just said indirectly, and which made it slightly easier and considerably harder simultaneously. "More than once a week," he agreed. He rode to the Mercer ranch with the feeling of someone who has left something essential behind but knows where to find it, which is not as bad as losing it, but is still a particular kind of ache. He wrote more than once a week. She wrote back with letters that were precise and detailed and occasionally very funny, and once or twice, when she allowed it, deeply tender. They wrote about everything: the ranch's autumn operations, the state of her cattle after the improvements to the water access, the weather in its various personalities, the books they were reading, the thoughts that occurred at 3 in the morning when sleep wasn't coming. He saved all her letters in the same cedar box he had found among his mother's things after she died, which was the most valuable container he owned. March arrived with tentative warmth, and Beatrice arrived with it, riding Clara and accompanied by Pete Sims, who had been working on the Tanner property through the winter, and who Harrison had asked quietly to make the journey with her for safety's sake. She rode up the lane of the Mercer ranch in the late afternoon, and Harrison came down from the main house to meet her, and the moment she swung down from Clara, he crossed the remaining distance and held her the way you hold something you have been careful with across a long time and can now actually feel the reality of. She held him back with both arms tightly, and then she stepped back and looked up at him with a brightness in her face that he had not seen before, or had not seen in quite this way. "You look well," she said. "You look extraordinary," he said. "I have been on a horse for 2 days," she said. "I very much doubt that." "You look extraordinary," he repeated without adjusting the statement. She looked past him at the ranch, the main house with its solid construction, the well-kept-out buildings, the cattle in the distant pastures, the land running out toward the hills. She looked at it all with careful, appreciative attention, and he watched her looking and waited. "It's beautiful," she said finally. "It is genuinely beautiful. Thank you," he said. "I have been working on it for 12 years. It shows." She looked back at him. "I can see your mother in it," she said. "Not literally, but the way it's been done, carefully, with a particular kind of stubbornness." He felt something close in his throat. "Yes," he said. She took his arm and they walked up to the main house, and Pete Sims led the horses to the barn, and the spring evening settled around them golden and unhurried. She stayed for a week. She met Samuel Brooks and his wife Nora, who lived in the foreman's house at the edge of the property and who Beatrice liked immediately. She met the ranch hands, 14 of whom were present for the week, and she talked with all of them with the directness that she brought to everything and which they responded to with visible respect. She rode the property's boundaries with Harrison on the second day and asked 100 careful questions about the management, the water, the grazing, the relationship with the railroad contract. On the evening of the 4th day, she sat across from him at the dinner table in the main house after Nora had served and gone home, and she said, "I have a condition." "Tell me," he said. "The Tanner property stays in my name. We run them as separate ranches for the time being. Pete Sims manages the Tanner operation under my direction. I review the books monthly." "That is more than reasonable," he said. "I will not become an appendage," she said. "I know," he said. "I have never wanted an appendage. I want a partner." She looked at him steadily. You are serious about that, Beatrice? He leaned forward slightly. I fell in love with a woman who stood alone on church steps and refused to run. I am not going to spend the next 40 years trying to turn her into someone who does what she's told. She was quiet for a moment. Then, are you expecting 40 years? At minimum, he said. She looked at the table and then back up at him, and she was Beatrice Tanner in full, clear, unguarded, the person she was when she had stopped managing the impression she was making and was just herself. Yes, she said. Yes to 40 years. Yes to all of it, she said. To the marriage and the partnership and the 40 years. Yes. He reached across the table, and she reached back, and they held on to each other across the dishes of the dinner table in the lamplight of the main house of the Mercer ranch. And the spring night outside was full of the sounds of the land they would work together. They married in May, in a small ceremony in the Caldwell church that bore no resemblance to the hostile crowd on its steps from the previous August. Reverend Graves officiated with the warm solemnity of a man who felt personally invested in the outcome. Thomas Hawley came from Wichita and stood in the first row with a proprietary satisfaction, as if he had arranged the whole thing, which in a sense was not entirely false. Samuel and Nora Brooks drove in from the ranch and sat beside Pete Sims, who had cleaned up extraordinarily well and who looked moved in a way that he would later describe as some dust in my eye. Beatrice wore a dress she had made herself from blue and cream fabric, because she had very specific opinions about what she wanted to wear, and did not consider that a deviation from tradition, but rather an improvement on it. It was the most beautiful dress Harrison had ever seen, which was entirely due to the fact that she was wearing it. She walked to him without assistance, down the center aisle, which seemed exactly right. The ceremony was brief and sincere, and when Reverend Graves asked if anyone knew any reason why these two should not be married, the room was entirely, completely, respectfully silent. Gerald Prout was not present. He had, by May, found himself facing a county inquiry into the legitimacy of several of his own property transactions, initiated by a very thorough and motivated Thomas Hawley, who had found Prout's manipulation of county records rather more extensive than anyone had realized. The inquiry would drag on for 2 years before concluding with the invalidation of 3 transactions and a substantial fine. Prout left Caldwell in 1884 and did not return. Dorothy Fenn followed her husband Archibald to a council position in Wichita, where they presumably continued being exactly themselves. Victor Crane was never heard from in Caldwell again. Harrison and Beatrice came home to the Mercer ranch in the late afternoon of their wedding day, because Beatrice had decided that was where they would live, and the Tanner property would be managed from a distance, which suited both of them. They had arranged for a small wedding supper to be laid out in the main house by Nora, who had a remarkable talent for celebration, and they ate it by lamplight with the windows open to the May air. After supper, Beatrice stood at the window looking out at the dark and the stars, and Harrison stood behind her and put his hands gently on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him with the ease of someone who has decided, completely and without reservation, that this is where they belong. "What are you thinking?" he said. "That my father would have liked you," she said, "enormously." "I think I would have liked him. You are very similar," she said, "in the important ways." He was stubborn about the right things and completely indifferent to the wrong things, and he understood that being strong does not require being loud. She paused. He would have put you in his chair by the fire and made you talk about cattle for 4 hours, and then told you that you were welcome in his house any time. "That sounds like the highest compliment," Harrison said. "It was how he expressed it," she said. She turned around and looked up at him. "I am very happy," she said, which was something she said rarely and meant completely. "I am very happy," he said, which was true in a way that used every definition of the word simultaneously. Their life together had a shape that suited them both. Beatrice ran the Tanner property with the systematic efficiency of someone who had been managing complexity since before she was 20, reviewing Pete Sims's monthly reports and making decisions about the cattle with the same absorbed attention she brought to everything. She and Pete had developed a professional relationship characterized by mutual respect and a shared preference for directness, and the Tanner herd improved steadily under their combined management. The Mercer ranch expanded in the second year. Harrison negotiated an additional parcel of land to the east, extending the grazing territory, and with the second year of the railroad contract secured, they brought on 5 more hands and grew the herd significantly. Beatrice became involved in the financial management of the Mercer operation by the end of the first year, because she had a precise and creative intelligence around financial planning that Harrison recognized immediately and had no interest in wasting. Samuel Brooks described her as the sharpest person in any room she walks into, and the only one who doesn't seem to know it, which was not entirely accurate. Beatrice knew it perfectly well, but was an accurate measure of the quality he was describing. In the autumn of 1883, their son was born. They named him Elias James Mercer, Elias for her father and James for his. He was a large and very determined baby who arrived with a full voice and an immediate, evident opinion about the quality of everything around him, which suggested he had inherited something from both parents. Harrison held him in the lamplight of the bedroom with the particular careful awe of a man who has been handed something entirely new to love, and Beatrice watched his face from the pillow and thought that she had never seen anything more worth seeing. Elias grew into a loud, energetic, endlessly curious boy who followed his parents around the ranch with the dogged persistence of someone who has calculated that the best education is direct observation. He was 4 when he decided he would like to ride Atlas, a negotiation with the horse that Harrison observed from a safe distance, and which concluded with Elias on Atlas's back looking triumphant and Atlas looking resigned. In 1886, their daughter arrived. Beatrice had said, during the months of waiting, that she wanted a daughter she could teach to stand on her own 2 feet before anyone could knock her down. And Harrison had said he wanted a daughter exactly like her mother, and Beatrice had said those were the same thing. They named her Margaret after Harrison's mother, and she was small and dark-eyed and immensely serious as an infant, studying her surroundings with an expression of careful evaluation that made visitors laugh and made Harrison feel a very specific, deeply personal warmth. Little Elias was 3 years old when Margaret arrived and took his role as her elder brother, with the overwhelming seriousness of someone who has just been given an important assignment and will not drop it. He explained things to her at length from the time she could sit up in the way that children explain things comprehensively, somewhat inaccurately, and with absolute conviction. She listened to all of it. Nora Brooks said once that watching the Mercer household was like watching something that had been correctly assembled for the first time after years of watching people put it together wrong. The Tanner property was sold in 1887 for a price that reflected its true value and not a penny less, to a young family from Missouri who had come west with their 4 children and considerable determination. Beatrice sold it to them herself, and she walked the boundaries with the new owner, a woman named Clara Dempsey who had her husband's complete confidence and who Beatrice liked immediately, and she showed her everything she knew about the land. She told her about the water access and the fence line, and the particular quality of the summer grass in the east pasture. She told her that the previous owner had loved this land with the patience of someone who understood that the land gives back what you put in, over time. She did not cry until she was on Clara's back, riding home, out of sight of the farmhouse. And then she allowed herself a small, controlled amount of grief, and then she put it away, which was precisely how she had cried at her father's grave and at every important thing since. Harrison was at the main house gate when she rode in, because he had known she would need this particular day to be gentle, and he came out and took Clara's bridle and looked up at Beatrice with the dark, steady eyes that had looked at her on church steps and in cemeteries and across dinner tables and in lamplight and in all the ordinary moments of 7 years. "How was it?" he said. "Good," she said. "The right people will love it." He helped her down from the saddle and held her for a moment, and she pressed her forehead to his shoulder briefly. "He would be satisfied," she said. "About all of it." "I believe he would," Harrison said. In 1889, Kansas became a state, which the territory celebrated with the particular combination of pride and pragmatism that characterized its residents. The Mercer Ranch celebrated with a dinner that Nora organized, and that included most of the ranch hands and their families, along with Samuel Brooks and a growing number of neighbors who had become genuine friends over the years. Thomas Hawley came from Wichita, older and drier and exactly the same. Reverend Graves, who was in his 70s and had reduced his congregation visits, came specifically for this occasion, and sat in the chair of honor that Harrison had placed for him with great intention. Beatrice stood in the kitchen door of the main house, which had been expanded twice in the 7 years to accommodate their lives, and watched the gathering with the particular pleasure of someone who has built something they could not have anticipated, and which has exceeded all reasonable expectation. Harrison came to stand beside her in the doorway. "What are you thinking?" he said, using the question he had asked from the first evening. "That 6 months was approximately the right amount of time," she said, which was the answer she had developed for when he asked it in this particular way. He laughed. She loved his laugh. He did not deploy it lightly, and when it came it was genuine and warm and full. Elias ran past them at the speed of a 7-year-old with somewhere important to be, followed by the son of one of the ranch hands at similar velocity, pursued at a thoughtful distance by Margaret, who was 3 and managed urgency with characteristic deliberateness. "Margaret!" Elias yelled from somewhere near the cook fire. "Come on!" Margaret turned to look at her parents from the middle of the yard, with the expression she shared with her father, dark-eyed and unhurried. And then she turned back and walked toward her brother with the pace of someone who has decided where she is going and does not require encouragement. Beatrice watched her go. "She is so entirely herself," she said. "She is entirely you," Harrison said, "which is the same thing," Beatrice said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and the evening came down warm and full over the Mercer Ranch, over the land they had worked, and the house they had built, and the people they had gathered, and the Kansas sky did what it always did at the end of a summer day, made something enormous and beautiful out of ordinary light. Reverend Graves found them there later, standing together in the last of the evening, and he looked at them with the expression of someone who has watched a great many human arrangements and knows when one has turned out right. "I want you to know," he said, "that your father would have chosen this for you, Beatrice, if he had been able to choose." She looked at the old reverend with eyes that were bright. "I know," she said, "and you," he said to Harrison, "have done well." He said it in the way that her father had expressed pride, simply, once completely, as though the words were enough, as though the words were everything. Harrison looked at the people in the yard, at Elias running in the firelight, at Margaret walking with her careful deliberateness, at Samuel and Nora sitting together near the door, at Pete Sims talking to one of the new hands with the same quiet attentiveness he brought to every situation, at Thomas Hawley telling an elaborate story to a small audience who were clearly not following it, but enjoying his enthusiasm. He looked at Beatrice beside him. "I know," he said. There was no secret left between them that was not also a gift. There was no dark past that had not been turned, slowly and with considerable effort, into the foundation of something sound. There was no question about who they were to each other, because they had answered it every day for 7 years in the language of ordinary things: coffee and fence work and letters across the winter distance, and hands reaching across dinner tables and names spoken in the dark with full and unhurried honesty. Beatrice Tanner Mercer looked up at her husband in the doorway of the house they had built together, on the land that no one had been able to take, under the stars of a state that was finally and officially what it had always been trying to become. And she thought that her father had been right about something he had told her once, when she was young, and had asked him what made a life worth living. He had thought about it carefully, the way he thought about everything, and he had said, "The people you choose, and the things you build with them, and the courage it takes to choose them in the first place." Harrison Mercer turned and looked at her, and she smiled at him, and he smiled back, and the Kansas night held them, and that was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was, in the particular and irreplaceable way of things that have been genuinely and properly earned, everything.